The Center for Chinese Studies is delighted this evening to join with the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies to present James Milward, Associate Professor of History at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Jim received his bachelor's degree from Harvard, where he ate Chinese food at Hong Kong Chinese food in Cambridge. Just the scorpion bowls. We were just talking about that terrible restaurant. An MA from the School of Oriental and African Studies in 1985, and his PhD in history from Stanford in 1993. He is the author of numerous books, including Beyond the Pass, Economy, Ethnicity, and Empire in Qing Central Asia, 1759 to 1864, and also Eurasian Crossroads, A History of Xinjiang, which was published in 2008 by Columbia University Press. Tonight, Professor Milward will be speaking on A Highly Civilized Country, 3,000 Years of China in the World. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to the Center for Chinese Studies and the Weisinger Center? Weiser Center, excuse me, for hosting me and for having this very exciting-looking conference, which is starting tomorrow, on the nines, on these key moments and cusps in history. A lot of places this year, obviously, are commemorating or at least remembering 1989 in one way or another. They tend to focus on Eastern Europe, on Soviet Union, and the year in that quarter of the world. Less focus on 1989 in China or in other countries, and that's one of the things that's exciting about this symposium that's coming up, because it's more diverse geographically, more diverse chronologically, and speaking personally, it gives me a chance as someone who works on China, but from a point of view positioned on the borders of China and Central Asia, or in Eurasia. It gives me a chance to weigh in on these things as well. So I'm very grateful to be here. My title has evolved a little bit since I was asked to give it to you. You see what it is. I am a Eurasianist, really. If you came because Eurasia was in the title, I hope you won't be disappointed that I've changed it, but I'm not here under entirely false pretenses. But I wanted to focus on China a little bit more here, because of the many changes in many places over the last 20 years, since 1989, arguably some of the most surprising have been those coming from China. So as we're sort of taking stock and looking back, I thought it'd be useful to focus on China for a while. Now I want to begin with another ennial year. And by the way, this is a conference on the nines. I don't know if any of the rest of the conference participants who were sort of thinking about this, some of you are here, I know. We have to write papers dealing with years ending in 9. And I was just stumped trying to find an adjective that means 9. And I was playing around, and the Latin root just sort of doesn't work. And so I finally found the Greek root. And so by analogy with Enneahedron, or Ennead, I made up a word, and it's enneal, E-N-N-E-A-L. And I'm using it in my first sentence, and I promise I won't use it again for the rest of my talk. But in another enneal year, 629, 1,380 years ago, not long after the founding of the Tang Dynasty, a scholar monk named Shenzhen slipped out past guards on the Tang frontier in Gansu, North China, and traveled through the deserts and mountains of Central Asia to India. He was on a quest to gather Buddhist sutras and other writings in hopes of improving the textual basis of Buddhism in China. The faith had entered mainland East Asia centuries earlier, but the corpus of Buddhist literature was incomplete, and translations and interpretations were sometimes questionable. And Xuanzang hoped to remedy this by a period of foreign study in India. So he spent the 630s and the 640s in India gathering sutras and ended up staying at an Indian college in a place called Nalanda with thousands of Indian monks. He was not the first Chinese Liu Shisheng, the first Chinese foreign student in India. Others had been there centuries before. But Xuanzang would be the most influential because of his great scholarship and the massive translation project that he embarked upon after his return to China. Xuanzang's biographer, Hui Li, relates a curious exchange between Xuanzang and a group of Indian monks in Nalanda. And I want to start out by looking at this exchange because it has a strangely contemporary ring, I think. Now, Hui Li writes that as Xuanzang was packing up his sutras and Buddhist icons and preparing to return to China, a group of Indian monks approached him, and they were puzzled why he would want to go back to China at all. In particular, they wanted to know why he would return to, and the term they used was Zhina Guo. And Zhina is an old Sanskrit term for China. Ultimately, it comes from the Qin dynasty, and it's the source of our word for China. So in this place, Zhina, as they called it, and they argued that the common people are slighted, and the Dharma is despised. The Buddhas are never born in that country. The Buddha was, in fact, born in India, they said. And saints and sages do not go to Zhina. The climate is cold, the land is full of dangerous mountains. What is there for you to miss? What is there for you to be nostalgic about in this place? And besides, they said, Zhina was a mlecha place. Now, mlecha is a word that means barbarian. From Sanskrit, it's actually in modern Indian languages as well. So here we have a Chinese scholar abroad in India studying Indian Buddhism and eager to bring the fruits of his study home to China. He's confronted by monks who are steeped in that same Buddhist culture, who are calling his home a barbarian land. So not surprisingly, Xuanzang gets a little bit testy in his response. So the master says in reply, "The king of the Dharma has founded his teachings, and it is proper for us to propagate them. How can we forget about those who are not yet enlightened while we have gained the benefit in our own minds? Moreover, that country, Zhina, is highly civilized, and the people have a code of conduct to observe. The emperor is sagacious, his ministers are loyal. The father treats his son with benignity, and the son is filial to his father. Kindness and righteousness are esteemed, and the aged and virtuous are respected." So Xuanzang bridles at this criticism of Zhina, and he mounts his defense in classic Confucian terms. Right? China is civilized, first of all, since they wear proper clothing. That's what this Chinese phrase here means. All the proper relationships are maintained. And then after he goes on, he mentions China's accomplishments at understanding and controlling the natural world. He continues, another long slide here. And here he talks about Buddhism. The Buddhas bequeathed the Dharma to be spread to the East. They've laid importance on Mahayana teachings, and it should be practiced. So the they is all in this passage referring to the Chinese. Chinese have cherished the mind to practice bodhisattva deeds and wish to attain the level of the 10th stage of bodhisattvahood. They put their hands palm to palm, realizing the three bodies of the Buddha. Saints who heard wonderful teaching with their own ears and saw new golden figures with their own eyes, have shown spirituality to edify the people personally with the Dharma. So how can you despise this land simply because the Buddha was not born there? So the Buddha may not have been born there, but there are also good Buddhists there, right? So he justifies China's civilization in completely different terms here as they're good Buddhists in addition to maintaining Confucian civilization. And so they cannot be mlecha, they cannot be barbarians if they're good Buddhists. Now, there's a lot that's interesting about this episode. What I find most interesting right now is the way the encounter reveals rival, but quite similar, self-centered worldviews. To the Indian monks, India and their Buddhist culture is at the center, and their comments peripheralize China and question its civilization. Xuanzang's response attempts to recenter China, both in its own terms and in Buddhist terms. It is, in effect, Xuanzang's effort to reconcile his own sinocentrism with the fact that he, as a Chinese Buddhist, is deeply invested in the cultural product of India. So I think it's not too hard to imagine a similar scene today in which a Chinese graduate student, for example, at a US university might face classmates who would criticize China's lack of democracy or free press or treatment of minorities or human rights record in general, something like that. And while in defending China, this graduate student might not stress the same points as Xuanzang exactly. he would nonetheless find his classmates' challenge irritating for the same reasons, I think. Because the questioners are assuming that he should naturally subscribe to their worldview since he's busy studying here. And they, in these criticisms, are revealing that they see China as peripheral to what is most important in the world. And he would probably not agree with that. So the Tang Dynasty, when that episode happened, was famously one of China's most open, cosmopolitan, and expansive periods, when a good deal of intercultural and international exchanges took place. China has had other such periods. We are, of course, in one right now. One could say, though, that this current period of Chinese expansion and globalization actually began during the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, which in the 18th century doubled China's territory by annexing. Do I have a cursor? Yeah. Yeah, so you can see that. By annexing, sort of coming out of Manchuria, annexing Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet, and adding it to the provinces that had been the Ming dynasty before that. Also, this was the period when China entered into relations with European countries. Now, in the 19th and early 20th century, when a few European countries, followed by Japan, enjoyed military superiority thanks to early industrialization, the Qing and then China was at a disadvantage and took pains to catch up. Now, a century or so later, even not quite a century, it can be said that in many significant respects, China has in fact caught up. And in fact, with it financing close to $1 trillion of US debt right now and producing much of what the US and the world consumes, it's no longer exactly clear who needs to catch up to whom. Now, at this point, the question that seems to be on everyone's mind, not least that of the Chinese, I'd say, is that what this caught up China exactly is going to do. The US government and the world have officially offered China a place at the table through such measures as accession to the World Trade Organization and to hosting the Olympics. There's a new formulation that the US has offered to describe China's role. China is to be a stakeholder in the world system. But will China be satisfied simply with a stake in a post-Cold War system that is largely of Euro-American design? Or will it want to use its economic power and growing political clout to change the rules of the game? Many people, both in China and out, are looking to history, to Chinese history, for indications as to what a Chinese-influenced world order would look like. And that's not easy to do, given the scale of China's history. And what makes it still more complex is that when we look at Chinese history, we're dealing not with a simple set of fixed facts about the past, but simultaneously with multiple and mutually influencing interpretations of the past. There is, first of all, an ideal vision of a Chinese world order as described in classical Chinese works or Chinese classical works of political philosophy. Then there is what various Chinese states and their relations with other countries and peoples were really like at various points over some 2,000 years, as is reflected, as we can get to it, in the historical sources. And then there's political propaganda from those same sources about what those states were like. And then there's modern analysis and theorizing and interpretation of these texts in light of modern events and concerns, especially the rise of the Chinese nation and involvement with the modern world. So our understanding of China's historical worldviews and intersocietal relations derives from, first of all, this highly schematic classical vision, but as it is pushed through many layers, many types of filters, and to be seen today. So in the rest of my remarks tonight, I want to try to highlight some of the problems with this way of looking at the Chinese past and sort some of these problems out. There are a set of interrelated notions which together underpin our understanding of the Chinese past, and particularly what I'm calling the Chinese worldview. Historians have challenged many of these notions, but lately political scientists and international relations theorists, political pundits and so on, when commenting on China, have rediscovered this set of old notions. And I think they should be broadly familiar even to people who aren't specialists in Chinese history, because they are infused through the paradigm with which China is portrayed not only in textbooks, but in TV documentaries, in news articles, in op-eds, even in fictional works. So I want to discuss them now under these four headings of atemporal China, the Tianxia all under heaven model, sinicization or expansion by cultural attraction thesis, and the tributary system. So to begin with atemporal China. Isn't it curious that in the Shenzhen account, China is referred to by a Sanskrit word for what was then a long defunct Chinese state, the Qin state. Qina is not a word that Chinese would readily have used for themselves. It's transcribed in the Chinese of the Tang period, but it was not a word that would have been used at that time. The general modern term for China that we use today, as most of you know, Zhongguo, literally means the central states or central state. But to Shenzhen and to other Buddhist monks, the central country, the central land, actually meant India, because that's where the Buddha came from. So you'll see Zhongguo in these texts, and they're talking about India with that term. Shenzhen considered himself to be a man of the Great Tang, and his biography and other works have Great Tang in their title. So he was a man of Tang, not of Zhina or one of these other terms. Now we always tend to talk about China as a continuous political entity with thousands of years of history. And the history of this continuous entity is divided up into a series of things which we call dynasties. But however, as the problem of finding a single name for China spanning this whole period suggests, the actual political history of the East Asian mainland has involved many distinct and often synchronous rival polities, with greatly varying territories, names, and ethnocultural makeup. Now, one set of these various states has been recognized as the set of Chinese dynasties, and other states in the same place at various times have been excluded. And the way this process is, this process is an ideologically driven historiographical convention, which is known as the Daotong. And in fact, although the dynasties are often portrayed as a linear list, for many long periods, there were actually more than one Chinese dynasty, more than one China existing at the same time, and in different parts of what is now China. For example, this list includes several warring states before they were, or a concept of China in this list includes the warring states before they are unified by the first emperor, by the Qin emperor. It also excludes many states, some of them very sizable and powerful, that once occupied large parts of what China is today, such as Nanzhao or Xisha kingdoms. And conversely, it includes several large and important states whose rulers were non-Chinese or non-Han, such as the Tabgach state of the Tuoba Wei, the Khitan Liao, the Jurchen Jin, the Mongol Yuan dynasty, the Manchu Qing, and others. But rather than arguing about who is Chinese and who is not, it's perhaps better simply to recognize that what makes any given state on the East Asian mainland Chinese is not anything intrinsic about its ruling elite or its people, but rather a retrospective decision to write it into the Daotong, to write it into this list of dynasties as part of the official chain of official histories, of dynastic histories. And it is these decisions by each dynasty, when writing the history of its predecessor and deciding which state should be considered a worthy predecessor, that produced the substructure which undergirds our approach to Chinese history, and which can be seen, of course, in the 24 official histories of China, but also in textbooks, in curricula, in the Cambridge History of China, and so on. Now, these decisions to include certain states and exclude others, they were not entirely arbitrary, but they were very highly politicized. These decisions were made for political reasons. And so this apparently continuous chain of Chinese dynasties, then, should be seen more as a deliberate ideological construction than as an objective fact. Now, modern Chinese regimes have taken this logic even further. All the peoples who ever occupied any part of the former Manchu Qing Empire, which was the largest territory of any dynasty in China, any peoples who ever occupied any part of that are categorized now as Chinese peoples, ancestors of China's ethnic groups today, regardless of the extent of China's territory at earlier periods. And so this argument can give rise to controversy, as over Goguryeo, which was a state between 37 BC and 668 AD. It was a kingdom that spanned what is now northeast China, the Russian Maritime Province, and northern and central Korean peninsula. Now, Koreans see Goguryeo as the progenitor of their own nation, but some scholars in the PRC today are arguing that it is Chinese, in fact. Although the practice of labeling and legitimizing states on the East Asian mainland by including them in this list of official histories, which are written in a particular format, this practice goes back centuries. But the adoption of the nation-state idea in the late 19th and early 20th century highlighted the necessity to treat and name China as a constant political quantity. Now, to say, as I'm saying, that there was no single historically and territorially continuous unitary political entity called China before modern times, this does not undermine China as a nation, and that's not my intent at all. But what it does do is recognize that China is like Europe, or arguably even the Islamic world, at least the Central Islamic world. It was a continental civilization with cultural, social, and institutional continuity amidst ethnic diversity and political flux. China over the past few centuries and today is a large unified territory, while Europe and the Islamic world are not. But if you choose a different time period, if you tune in at different points in history, then the relative degree of political unity within each civilization or each region is different. Okay, on to my next concept here, the notion of Tianxia. Now, Tianxia, or all under heaven, as it is usually rendered in English, this is a term that's been used in Chinese since ancient times. The scale of Tianxia is vague. Some might say deliberately vague. It can mean our land, and it was glossed like this in the movie Hero, which some of you may have seen, and written with a sword in the sand in a climactic moment. It can mean the empire, or it can mean the world, or the known world. But there's an implicit understanding that Tianxia was centered on a Tianzi, on a son of heaven, or an emperor who was responsible for the ritual mediation between natural forces and mundane human affairs. Tianxia is thus the world, perhaps, but it's a Sinocentric world, except when the same notion was adopted by other neighboring monarchs, such as Korea or Vietnam, and in those cases, the center shifted accordingly. And what has most interested modern analysts about the all under heaven model are its fuzzy political and ethnic boundaries and its hierarchical incorporation of outlying and culturally non-Chinese areas. Famous classical texts, such as the Tribute of Yu and the Rites of Zhou, describe the world within the four seas as a series of zones, each 500 li, 500 Chinese miles across. Each outlying zone is politically less closely controlled by the center and culturally further from ritually proper ways. The outermost rings are said to be inhabited by wild tribes and dangerous criminals. Now, a 19th century translator of the Chinese classics named James Legge diagrammed this scheme as a series of nested squares, as you see here. And he even went through the mathematical calculations to ascertain the area of China at the time based on this, although the text is clearly a description of an idealized Arcadian age and not meant to be a real geography. The most influential 20th century American historian of China, John K Fairbanks, adopted the same idea of concentricity in his descriptions in several books of the Chinese world order. And one book jacket of Fairbanks modified this old Legge illustration, making it more circular and emphasizing this concentricity. Now, Fairbanks suggested that China's traditional imperial Tianxia ideology, that within this there was no real distinction between domestic and foreign. There were no national boundaries, or they were unimportant, but rather imperial rule radiated outward in a continuous field, taking in civilized, that is, Sinic, or Chinese lands first, but then extending indefinitely out over outlying barbarians as well. Barbarians who would ideally convert to civilized Chinese ways. And Fairbanks' point was that it was particularly difficult for Chinese in the 19th century to reconcile this traditional, as he called it, worldview with the modern, as he called it, post-Westphalian system of discrete and nominally equal nation-states, each circumscribed by clearly defined political boundaries. And thus, when the British attempted to integrate China into this modern world, a clash was inevitable, and that's Fairbanks' sort of main central point. Now, for no period of Chinese history does the real situation match this classical picture, either in the actual political geography of East and Inner Asia, or in how states in and around China interacted. And historians have long pointed this out. Nonetheless, the tendency among modern analysts to confuse the ideal all-under-heaven model with real international relations continues. And I'll say more about this in a few minutes. Concept number 3, expansion by cultural attraction, the Sinicization thesis. Closely associated with the vision of Tianxia is an ideological explanation for how China, this continuous polity that was actually neither continuous nor a single polity, how China grew from ancient cradle in North China to its current size and ethnic diversity. And this is a map of the Shang dynasty, just to give you a sense of the origin point in this imagined process, Now, in the course of this expansion, China took in land south of the Yangtze River, extending to Southeast Asia, extended up into the northeast to Manchuria. It took in Mongolia, Xinjiang in Central Asia, Qinghai, and Tibet on the Tibetan Plateau. And so we get to the modern map. And of course, Mongolia was lost, but it had been part of the Qing dynasty. Now, both Taoist and Confucian political thought stress that a kind of laissez-faire rule by moral example is superior to direct or coercive rule. With regard to peoples culturally unlike the Huaxia, which is another term used, another classically term used, which is translated as Chinese. With regard to Huaxia peoples, the classical argument has been, that has been most influential, comes from a 2nd century BC commentary on a Confucian text. And it says that non-Chinese tribes in peripheral regions assimilate themselves spontaneously through contact with the superior culture of China. And in this way, the realm expanded. So that's a classical sort of ideal, of classical political philosophy. Modern ideologues and historians, though, have taken this utopian notion, this utopian philosophy, and recast it as history. For example, the head of the Kuomintang government, Chiang Kai-shek, wrote in 1940 that China had always expanded by culture and not military might. As you see, it grew by an amalgamation of various stocks into this harmonious and organic whole. It occurred in every dynasty. It was not military might that did this, but rather assimilation. So the same idea. Now, this is obviously propaganda when we read it today. And the idea that, but although it is transparent propaganda, the idea that Chinese expansion occurred by a peaceable conversion of neighbors and conquerors, by Sinicization, remains influential and common. Works of history written in today's, in the PRC today, unfailingly use the term unify, or tongyi, rather than conquer, for territorial expansions of past dynasties, in particular the Qing dynasty. Dynasties generally considered China's greatest, the Han, the Tang, the Qing, all expanded the territory. Cultural diffusion did play a role, to be sure, but this process involved military campaigns is indisputable and clearly documented in official histories and other sources. And in this, of course, China is no different from the Roman Empire or the initial expansion of Islam or many other places. So that That cultural attraction was not the primary mechanism for Chinese expansion can be demonstrated in many historical points. The first unification by the state of Qin of its neighboring states, of course, obviously was achieved by conquest. More than that, however, recent archaeological and historical research has shown that the walls, the Great Wall built by the first Qin emperor, which is usually treated as a defensive buffer for North China, was actually a device for defending territory that the Qin had recently conquered and cleared of nomadic inhabitants and then colonized with farmers and exiled criminals. And there's another kind of powerful piece of evidence along these lines, which comes from genetic studies. The earliest and most significant expansion of Huaxia peoples was from the north to the south of the Yangtze River, to wetter lands inhabited originally by Dayak, Hmong Mien, and Austroasiatic peoples. And these are the ancestors of the hill tribes and others in southwest China and Southeast Asia today. Now, recent studies on DNA variation in today's Han populations provide evidence of how Chinese-style farming spread south of the Yangtze during the first millennium of the current era. Markers in today's male Y chromosome DNA show relatively little mixing with indigenous southern populations. Markers in female markers in mitochondrial DNA, on the other hand, show much more evidence of mixing of southern and northern populations, of these hill tribe populations with the Han, or with the northern peoples. So what this means is that rather than indigenous populations culturally assimilating to Chinese ways en masse, the DNA suggests that migrating Han drove off or killed indigenous Dayak, Hmong Mien, or Austroasiatic males while taking indigenous southern women as mates. And again, in this respect, Chinese history resembles many other parts of the world. Similar studies on European populations suggest that this kind of what we call demic, as opposed to cultural diffusion, brought agriculture to Western Europe from the Fertile Crescent. A similar process accompanied Indo-European expansion into the Indian subcontinent. Okay, and now I'm on to my fourth category here, the tributary system. Now, so far, I've raised questions about the interlocking notions of what I'm calling atemporal China, about Tianxia, and about the sinicization or cultural diffusion thesis. My point has been that while reference to these concepts do appear in Chinese texts, and so they're not made up out of the whole cloth, they're largely political or philosophical ideas or historiographical conventions. And while certainly worthy of analysis, the co-optation of these concepts in aid of writing modern Chinese nationalist history and propaganda, or as models for understanding China's past or future position in the world, tends to confuse the ideal and the real. And yet, despite logical flaws and empirical problems, to the contrary, these concepts have proven singularly resistant to revision and continue to shape how both history is written and how China is understood by political scientists, policymakers, and the general public, both non-Chinese and Chinese. Now, probably the grandest and most encompassing of all of these notions is that of the tributary system. It incorporates elements of each of the other ones I've mentioned so far. The tributary system was a core concept in what Fairbanks called the Chinese world order, and through his works, and though his works were quite nuanced on the subject, the impression that they collectively left was less nuanced. It goes something like this. Through the ages, a xenophobic and anti-commercial China managed its diplomacy and foreign commerce through a system that required potential trade partners to visit the Chinese capital and pay tribute in an elaborate ritual designed to demonstrate the emperor's and Chinese superiority and centrality in the world. Tribute and trade, diplomacy and commerce had been inextricably linked in this traditional Chinese system until that system was smashed by British gunboats in the Opium Wars, and a series of treaties modernized Chinese international trade and diplomatic institutions. So that's roughly the tributary system model. Now, this influences our understanding of two things. China's manner of conducting foreign trade, and its traditional mode of foreign relations. While some aspects of the model are still useful, historians of China have critiqued and largely rejected the idea that there was ever such a system, such a unified system. And without going into detail on this, the main problem is that the historical record contains too many examples and counterexamples of both trade and diplomacy functioning in other ways, unlike the model, at different dynastic periods, or even at the same time. And furthermore, the tribute system approach suggests that China stifled trade on ideological grounds. And we hear this all the time today. Fareed Zakaria, the political pundit and so TV analyst, tells us in his recent book that as a result of an imperial ruling in the early 15th century, ending the famous maritime missions of Zhenghe, the result of this, Zakaria writes, Asian commercialism was buried for centuries because in China, the emperor could turn back time. Now, in fact, historians of China now know that precisely those centuries he's talking about were among the most commercially vibrant times in China, a time when China was indeed a central engine of the early modern world economy. Private traders were bringing in huge amounts of silver from Europe, from Japan, and most importantly from the New World, in exchange for Chinese manufacturers that everybody everywhere else wanted. And this is supposedly during the time that everyone sees China as stagnant and commercially cut off. Another idea coming from this is that the tribute system was founded on a Sinocentric cosmology. Now, this has been challenged by new research on the Qing dynasty that shows that China at this point was not really ideologically Sinocentric, but centered rather on a multi-ethnic conquest elite forged by the Manchus, who understood Mongol and Tibetan ideology as well as that of China and organized their international affairs accordingly, and often highly creatively. New commercial and diplomatic arrangements worked out with the British after the Opium War, which used to be seen as part of the arrival of modernity in China, in fact seem to be, or can be shown, archivally shown, that they were recycled ideas that had first been tried out on the borders of Central Asia by the Qing state, years before their dealings with the British. So despite all these stakes driven into his heart, the tributary system idea just won't stay dead, but continues to stalk the pages of pundits, popularizers, and political scientists. No offense to political, there's a lot of you there. I may have some stakes in my heart before I'm done. Because of the heavy weight of our historiography, or because of its heavy weight upon our historiography of a series of events in the process of the British-Qing relationship, this set of particular ceremonial practices, which were themselves often quite flexibly applied and modified as necessary, they've come to stand for 2 millennia of Chinese international relations. Now, there are a couple more problems with the model. The most serious occur when these aspects of the ceremony, these self-flattering idealizations in Chinese court records about these rituals, when they're treated as real descriptions of the relative power relations of participating parties. This term tribute, I have a big problem with. It's a misnomer and a mistranslation of the term gong, which it comes from. Because unlike in the Roman case, from which the word tribute is drawn, payments by China's diplomatic partners were not onerous taxes. They were not huge levies of grain or other valuable commodities, but rather symbolic gifts. And the value of Chinese gifts in return, as everyone who's read about this knows, often was higher than that of the gifts which the diplomatic partners actually brought, of what they brought. So rather than calling these tributes, it might be better to see them simply as gift exchange, which again makes China not so different from other places. Chinese traditional historiography customarily places the Chinese emperor in a superior ritual position vis-a-vis foreign visitors. But just as presentation of these gifts did not mean a real tax or a tribute of high value to the Chinese state, so too, just because the Chinese sources call the states or peoples that participated in these rituals vassals, just because they call them vassals doesn't make it so. There was a charade at the heart of these diplomatic rituals, And people at the time knew this. Fairbank also recognized it. But the fact has sometimes been forgotten or obscured by later historians. For example, English language historical maps of the Qing dynasty sometimes draw in Vietnam or Burma or Nepal or parts of Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or Uzbekistan as part of the Qing realm. Now, in fact, under the Qing, Beijing had little or no influence over many of these places. But they're drawn in, and you may have seen these, they're sometimes drawn in a different color, as tributaries or with various terms suggesting some kind of vassal-like relationship with China. But that's just not historically true. Sometimes Chinese writers will apply this tributary notion in a deliberately disingenuous way, equating it to Chinese sovereignty. PRC historians have argued, for example, that missions by Central Asian princes to present gifts to the Ming court, I'm quoting here, show us that these princes saw themselves as Ming vassals, members of the Chinese nation. And this is in things published in the 1990s or 2000s. Although the missions in question took place at a time when China had no control whatsoever over these Central Asian territories. Now, it's extremely common, even in diplomacy carried out today, to exaggerate one's own country's significance or seek ways to bolster one's international image symbolically. Diplomats still negotiate over the seating plans and shape of tables, but we should not confuse symbolic gestures with the real constellation of power. Okay, so just some more sort of thoughts to conclude and bring this up to the present. Why does all this matter to anybody other than pedantic historians? It matters because the conventional wisdom of policymakers, IR theorists, and influential writers on the world today is strongly shaped by these kinds of notions, which they imbibed as undergraduates or picked up through general work of writers like Jared Diamond, Paul Kennedy, or David Landis. And if you look at any of these sort of macro histories or sort of macro sociologies of the world, they tend to be sort of steeped in these same concepts that I've talked about. Now, John Maynard Keynes once wrote that practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. And so we've seen already the inordinate influence on US policy of Samuel Huntington's Class of Civilizations idea or of Bernard Lewis's What Went Wrong of these approaches to Islam. Despite the fact that the views of these two scholars were in a minority among scholars of the Middle East. And I'm saying that similar stereotyped, inaccurate, but deeply entrenched conventional wisdom likewise shapes our view of China's past and present. And I'll give just one recent example in a book written by international relations scholar David Kong, very influential book known as China Rising. Some of you may know it. And it's really not fair to pick on David here. First of all, he's not here. Secondly, because he's opened himself up for a historian like me to come and jump on him because he actually looks at history, whereas many of his colleagues do not care to or bother to. Nonetheless, I'll pick on him anyway. Now, in this book, Kong outlines a view of East Asian international relations between the 12th and 19th centuries that really derives from this Fairbankian model. He has a Sinocentric, sort of Tian Xia tribute system influenced approach, and this causes him to dismiss, and I'm quoting here, Mongols, Uyghurs, and other nomadic peoples as non-state actors. And therefore, he leaves them out of the scheme. And so he can characterize China's last centuries before the arrival of European traders and gunboats as largely peaceful, and argues that China's relationships with its neighbors thus violates the usual pattern of balance of power politics in a system with a central hegemon. In this theory, other powers should gang up together to resist the hegemon, but they didn't, he thinks. And then extrapolates from this reading of history to argue that contemporary relations among Asian states and Asian countries will continue to revolve around and defer to China because of a residual Sinocentric and tributary mindset. Okay, so here's the tribute system and Sinocentrism informing his predictions about how Asian politics and international relations will work in the present. He may be right about that, but what he missed was, in fact, by leaving out those Mongols and Uyghurs who are not, in fact, nomadic, but other pesky nomadic peoples, he's left out where all the fighting actually was. And this is a very common oversight, because they don't fit into the Sinocentric scheme. There was, in fact, a geostrategic struggle on the Asian mainland from the 17th to the 18th centuries between the Qing and the Zhongar Mongols, Tibetan Buddhist Church, and Russia there, sort of in the wings, as a peripheral player. And while East Asia was certainly less plagued by wars than Europe in these centuries, Tibet and Mongol groups did indeed join together, as the model would predict, against the Qing. And they posed a serious challenge. It took a series of wars over 70 years and intense diplomacy, all of these which preoccupied the Qing court, led it to mobilize massive fiscal and organizational resources to support military campaigns over thousands of miles of frontier. Took all this to finally defeat the Zhongars, and resulted, by the mid-18th century, in the Qing having extended its power over those outlying territories of Mongolia, Xinjiang, Qinghai, and Tibet, and doubling its territory in the process. Now, this early modern episode of continental expansion is matched only by the eastward expansion of Russia or the westward expansion of Europeans in North America in the extent to which it expanded a territory. It doubled China's size. It left as an imperial legacy the ethno-nationalist problems that China now faces in Tibet and among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang today. Problems which affect China's international reputation and thus its place in the world as much as any other issue, arguably, as we saw in the events surrounding the Beijing Olympics, and then most recently last summer in Xinjiang. Now, this imperial history of Qing expansion is erased in Kang's China Rising. It's not seen as relevant because a Manchu-centered imperial expansion does not fit in the ideal model of tributary relations or cultural attraction. But it is, of course, a great moment to understanding China today. Not because it suggests so much that China is a military threat, which I don't really think it is, but because it explains the complexity of China's domestic, ethnic, and separatist problems. Now, Chinese scholars and leaders, too, are drawing on versions of these same concepts as China feels its way into the New World. Recently, a political philosopher at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Zhou Tingyang, presented a popular argument that China's Tianxia system could serve as an alternative to the system of nation-states, and indeed to the UN as a basis for world government. He writes, "All under heaven, the traditional Chinese ideal of world governance is based on winning over the hearts of the people, whereas other historical empires, even the UN, fail because of the individualism inherent in democracy or the fractiousness inherent in organizing a group of nation-states. All under heaven, on the other hand, is pluralistic, but does not afford special status either to individual persons or races, but rather forges collective order through peaceful attraction." So Zhou is thus trying to globalize this culturalist aspect of the Tianxia model. Now, he was critiqued on empirical grounds by other scholars in China, and there was a spirited debate about this. But the fact that he's bringing this up, the Tianxia model, and actually translating this notion Tianxia system, into Chinese like this, shows the continued influence and new applications of these models in a globalizing China. And it also meshes rather conveniently with Hu Jintao's political slogan, the notion of a harmonious society. Now, Hu himself has attempted to globalize his idea, or this idea, making a Confucian-tinged concept of the harmonious world a center point of his speech to the UN in 2005. And don't worry, I'm not going to reread his entire speech to the UN for you here. But you can see in bold type sort of some of the themes, some of the phraseology that evokes this notion of a harmonious world based on cultural attraction, but non-interference in other states' internal affairs. Now, these lines about intercivilizational dialogue and exchanges, allowing cultures to complement one another through competition and comparison, developing together, seeking common ground while putting aside differences, and so on. These are all generally unsurprising and unobjectionable sentiments. Who was at the time pushing back against the Bush administration unilateralism and pressure on China and other countries to democratize and follow human rights norms as interpreted by the US. And China feels that such norms are externally imposed on China without regard for China's special conditions. Now you might point out, a critic might point out, that this harmonious society policy does not seem to value pluralism, intercivilizational dialogue, or mutually coexisting complementary civilizations at home among different ethnic groups in China, but rather seems intent on imposing political, religious, and cultural uniformity, but especially in Tibet and Xinjiang. But China has an official answer to precisely this objection. China is in fact a signatory to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in September 2007. The US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, incidentally, did not sign this declaration. Now, this document calls for wide-ranging economic, educational, cultural, and other rights for members of indigenous groups. One might think that signing this declaration would pose problems for China, given the issues involving cultural autonomy of Tibetans, Uyghurs, and other minority peoples in China. And these would seem quite similar to those of indigenous peoples elsewhere. And yet a very particular understanding, a particular rhetoric about Chinese history, one that should be familiar to us by now, underpins the official position that China has no indigenous peoples. Now, China's representative to the group working on this, a man named Long Xuechun, laid this out actually a decade earlier, and this statement is still maintained on China's embassy websites. So the indigenous issues are a product of special historical circumstances. By and large, they're the result of a colonialist policy carried out in modern history by European countries in other regions of the world, especially America and Oceania, the non-signatories. As in the case of other Asian countries, the Chinese people of all ethnic groups have lived on our own land for generations. We suffered from invasion and occupation of colonialists and aggressors. Fortunately, after arduous struggles of all the groups, we drove away the colonialists. And in China, there are no indigenous peoples, and therefore no indigenous issues. All right, very tidy, this. But it relies upon several of the concepts that I've been talking about. First of all, this notion of an atemporal China. Right? What is China has always been China. The string of dynasties is always China. Likewise, China has come to incorporate so many different peoples, all these ethnic groups, not through any kind of colonial or conquest, military kind of process, but through cultural amalgamation. Cultural diffusion is implicit in this. There are no indigenous people in China because China is as it always has been, and all ethnic groups living there are by definition Chinese. Okay, so my intent here is not to pile on criticism of China's record in regard to democracy, human rights, or Tibet and Xinjiang. It's quite easy to do this, and currently not terribly helpful, I think, since such comments are viewed both officially and among much of the Chinese public as an attack, even as an imperialist attack, or as support for separatism. My point is a little bit different. China and America, or China and the West, if you want to use that term, are engaged in a conversation not unlike that between Xuanzang and the Indian monks 1,300 years ago. China, since the 1970s, has again been actively involved with the world. Now it's no longer a student, but a full-fledged contributing member of the world community. Still, in the US and to an extent in other Western countries, the US and other Western countries, in suggesting that China join us as a responsible stakeholder in the system and prodding it to be more like us, is in effect saying, well, the Buddha was born here. Come and study. Or in this case, not the Buddha, but the regime of international economic and political institutions, of human rights norms, and so on, which was born in the West. By all means, we say, leave your benighted peripheral lands and come join us. But like Xuanzang, many Chinese today bridle at the implication that China is peripheral, that its civilization and history are unimportant to today's global civilization. And not surprisingly, China, like Xuanzang, will seek ways to explain and justify its own civilizational centrality and thus counter our condescension. The historical paradigms that I've been critiquing this evening all make China seem unique, perhaps, but by the same token, these paradigms mystify and peripheralize China from world history. They make China seem exceptional from other places in the world. So the thrust of my critiques has been mainly to demystify our image of China's past. China is, of course, unique in many ways, with a remarkable and rich tradition. But in other ways, it is not so different from other parts of the human community. And while some of the points I've made tonight may wound pride and undermine certain narrow nationalistic or propagandistic uses of history, a more empirical, less ideological view of China's past can also facilitate dialogue and demonstrate that China and the West, and India and Africa and other places, are in fact common builders of the world system we now inhabit, just as we will all collectively work to find solutions to today's problems. Moreover, a more historically informed, a clearer view of the Chinese past reveals not one model of the Chinese world order, but many. During the Qing dynasty, there were official placards on palaces in Beijing that were written in Manchu, Chinese, Tibetan, Mongolian, and Uyghur. And this multilingualism explicitly reflected a culturally multipolar but politically centralized imperial system that, in fact, created the China that we know today. So there are, in fact, very real, historically confirmable, but non-Sinocentric models of pluralism in the recent Chinese past that could be drawn upon. And these could not only help the PRC develop solutions to issues involving Tibet, Xinjiang, or even Taiwan, but could indeed provide useful examples for the whole world to emulate. And I will end there and be very happy to take your questions.
I have a couple of questions. They're all sort of similar questions. One is, why do you think these ideas persist, given that historians have proven them wrong? Are they interest-based? Is it because of sort of laziness? Or is it a kind of pedagogical issue in terms of how maybe political scientists or social scientists in general are being trained? And I guess relatedly, my second question is, what if it doesn't matter that you're right? What if these ideas are so entrenched, these ideas are sort of what the worldview is, and it's continued not just by people outside of China, but also within China?
What has sort of prompted me to try to sort of pull this sort of critique of these various ideas together at this point, and sort of synthesize critiques that have been around for a while, is the fact that I've seen the tributary system and others of these sort of models coming back in recent years again. And I'm not 100% sure why that is, except that as an interlocking package of ideas, they are very powerful. It's a very sort of powerful paradigm. As I said, they have classical reference, and so you can see in the Chinese texts things that reflect these sorts of ideas. And the problem is in the actual empirical record, whether these are really good descriptions or simply idealized descriptions. So I'm not quite sure, except that it's not something which is going to collapse as a house of cards. They're interlocking, and it's a stable structure of ideas, and an impelling one. And it's one that Chinese, for nationalistic reasons, tend to accept because it builds up a sense of Chinese exceptionalism and uniqueness. It's one that Western scholars tend to accept for some of those same reasons, but also that it sort of explains what's seen as this clash of civilizations in the 19th century. So I don't know why. Now, your other question is, doesn't matter? And I think in a real sense, you're right, because ideas can have force themselves. If everyone thinks this is in fact how China functioned, and particularly when you start seeing scholars at the Academy of Social Science writing about this, and Chinese political leaders adopting some of these ideas, then in fact they may have real real force, real influence on policy making, and so on. And certainly, Chinese, in positions of authority and the scholarly community and what I call the scholar official community in China have adopted the idea of culturalism and as sort of China's unique sort of gift of the cultural way of negotiating interethnic relations, for example, as opposed to political ways of dividing them into using quotas or into fixed spaces and so on. And indeed, there's a move afoot, some people are talking about, to revise China's internal ethnic policies, which are based on the notion of autonomous areas, autonomous counties, autonomous prefectures, autonomous regions. Seeing that as a mistake, having borrowed it from the Soviet Union, and we all have seen what happened to the Soviet Union, and that China should revise its approach to this, do away with these politically defined minzu, or groups, and move instead to a more culturalist kind of approach, which has within it this sort of assimilationist notion. So these ideas may have real force. I don't think you can't throw them away, you can't ignore them. I suppose one part of me as a historian is simply saying, but they're just not right. And that's what bugs me about it. So, let's see, we have a question back there.
Thank you, Professor, for your excellent talk. I have a kind of a related question to what the U of M professor there and head of the department just asked you, and that's this. Do you think that because so many China scholars and commentators use these to suit them, any one of the four, at a particular time, depending on what it is that they're defending or rebutting, is done out of a little bit of insecurity, or is it so much that, or is it possible that there's a certain amount of truth to, not 100% truth, just like people remark about how America is a great melting pot. We brag about that, and we should. It's great. But yet we also have a history that, where there is slavery and things that we're not so proud of. So I'm wondering if maybe China similarly, their scholars or their people will use these four paradigms or aspects as a way of maybe defending themselves, either out of insecurity or because, on the other hand, that there's a certain amount of truth to each of these four. I'd just like to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, there is that's part of my point, is that there is a certain amount of truth to them, and that's one of the reasons why they hang around. They're also useful, particularly on issues regarding ethnicity, ethnic problems, ethnic tension, the status of territories like Tibet, and these kinds of things. An argument, for example, of culturalist expansion rather than military expansion. It seems to support China's sovereignty in those areas. I mean, going a little bit beyond what I've been saying tonight, I personally don't think that, the problem is China now cannot admit to an imperial past, right? They've got themselves in a position where they simply can't admit that in the 18th century, Manchu armies were galloping around conquering territory and that the territory was doubled. I can go read these histories. I don't even have to go to Beijing to do it. You can see them in the official histories, which are put up online. You can see this. It's very, very clear that this is the case. But officially, China is on record as saying that Xinjiang, for example, was part of China since the 2nd century BC. All right, and they've got themselves locked into that kind of position for these ideological reasons. Now, what if they didn't? What if they said, yes, well, we have this, imperial background? This was a large problem in a Marxist, ideological context, right? Because communism was to be the antidote to capitalism. Imperialism was the highest form of capitalism. You couldn't rationalize that. You couldn't cop up to an imperial past for this. For similar reasons, the U.S. doesn't have that problem, right? We have our many, many black marks on our own history, we tend to focus on those in our school books rather than the opposite. It hasn't always been that way. It would be very, very difficult, perhaps not as difficult internationally as domestically in China, to change the paradigm, to change the rhetoric about this, and to actually seek truth through facts and talk about the Qing Empire and these things in terms that are closer to what actually happened. But that's going to take a big leap to do that.
If you could clarify what you meant when you said dealing with the Uyghurs, not do it the Minzu sort of. Do you have a recommendation as to how that?
Do I have a well? This wasn't my recommendation. This was what anthropologists and some people writing theory articles about this in the last few years have suggested. That following the Stalinist approach to recognizing certain groups, that is, all right, so in the Soviet Union, like China, it has this imperial past, it has many numbers of different peoples. How do you think about these peoples? They thought about them as nationalities. And the Chinese term that was applied for this, used for this concept of nationality was Minzu. Right? They were, the Chinese state officially identified 55 minority Minzu plus one more, the Han. So there were a total of 56. These were fixed as political categories. Resources were allocated into those categories. Language, education, cultural production, and so on. All was channeled along those. And this system, somewhat mirroring the system in the Soviet Union with a few key differences, of assigning territory, of labeling territories as autonomous regions and districts was taken up. Now, real autonomy was never really in the cards, particularly in Tibet or in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. But the idea was there, and particularly in the 1950s, and again for a while in the 1980s, there were some hints that there was, some of this might actually happen. That has now come to be seen as a great liability, because it seems to bolster national feeling, that is non-Chinese national feeling. It seems to have stood in the way of creation of a broader Chinese identity, which Uyghurs and Tibetans would subscribe to. And so some analysts are seeing the problem as the original one of adopting the Soviet system in the first place. It was not appropriate to China, and as they've seen the Soviet Union fell apart, largely they think, perhaps erroneously, that it split along these lines of the socialist republics, right? And so they're arguing, without coming right out and saying we should do away with the autonomous regions directly, they're tending towards that, saying that we need to adopt a system more like that in the United States or in Europe, where we have ethnic groups, but that more of a melting pot kind of model, which incidentally is a paradigm very much like the ones that I'm criticizing for China, right? And move towards that. And that's an interesting comment or idea. In some ways I agree with it, because it's a form of globalization, right? China, if they see these peoples as ethnic groups along the lines of those in the United States or Europe or India or something like this, that is putting them on this, they're using the same terms as the rest of the world if we're talking about these sorts of problems. And that might make it easier to talk about these problems openly. For example, after the riots in Urumqi this last summer, the official line is that China has no ethnic problems. There is no, right? It's all outside instigators, right? I mean, and this is absurd on its face. But they have to say this because of this situation that they're in. So if they could kind of, treat these in a way similar to other countries, that might not be a bad thing. But what the implication of that is that you're going to do away with these autonomous regions. And the minority peoples, even though there's precious little real autonomy, to actually take that word away, take it off the map, that would be a major political change, and there would be a huge backlash against it, I think. So it's very, very, very sensitive territory. One last question, yes.
It seems that there is a problem from the outside by assuming that there is such a thing as historical continuity between imperial times and China as a nation state, it seems to me, right? It assumes from the outset that historical continuity matters and that the China that was founded in 1912 is somehow connected, eternally connected, as it were, with the imperial system that preceded it. And so it seems that by accepting that Zhongguo, the nation state, is the same as Zhongguo, this malleable cultural region of imperial times, are connected, that you basically stack the deck against you in this argument, it seems. So what would happen if you actually dispute the notion of historical continuity and you say the People's Republic of China does not have a very necessary connection with the imperial past, in the same way that we don't equate, say, modern Germany with Prussia, or Italy with the Roman Empire.
Or Turkey with the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I would say, yeah, that's what I would argue. That, China is a modern state, and that what we're basically talking about with China is 20th century China. Bill Kirby at Harvard has written about this, and I think that's a sensible way to do it. There are, however, facts on the ground that are continuations of the previous dynasty, right? I mean, the territory, the demographic makeup of China, these are the legacy of the Qing. And ideologically, modern Chinese states, or not modern, the 20th century both nationalist and communist states have been very, very concerned to explain that continuity and to justify that continuity and that transition from empire to nation state. And so a lot of these ideological permutations and twistings and turnings come out of the need to explain why, with a Chinese-centered nationalist movement first overthrowing the Manchus as alien invaders, you suddenly want to inherit all of the Manchu territories, right? I mean, that's a difficult circle to square, or square to circle. So, I mean, that's the problem. I guess I don't have a problem with what you just said, but that's a very controversial kind of argument. And it's what, I mean, finally, you're asking why these ideas stick around. Try to talk about, I teach world history a lot of the time. I have to teach, history 001, a lot of freshmen and so on. Try to teach about, China in the 2nd century or the 10th century and so on without using the word China. Just try it sometime. It's really hard to do. You end up saying, states on the East Asian mainland. You probably heard me doing that tonight, right? And it just gets tough. You can use it as a geographical and civilizational term, and you can explain all you want that that's how you're using it. But, it's China, and you say China, it has evocations in people's minds. So you can't rewrite the English language entirely for these purposes either. All right, thank you.